I lived in a small town when I was a kid. When I say small, I really do mean small. Only around 40 houses in a small crisscross of streets down a couple of miles from Boston. But we were one happy community. Parents could trust their neighbors to babysit their children for a weekend, mow their lawns, and low on sugar? Don't worry, Carla has some next door. Out of all the kids in the suburb, I had a great friend called Timmy. As Halloween began to roll over, Timmy and I began to work on our costumes. Him a ghost, and me a vampire. Our parents a couple of feet away began talking in hushed whispers. After a while, they came over and told us that a couple of children from the area had gone missing. We were naive little kids and would ask dumb stuff like how they just disappeared like that, or if they had invisibility powers. They simply told us to come straight home after school and to never go to house number 40 or talk to Mr. Odd. We called him Mr. Odd simply because we didn't know his real name, and well, because he was odd. He seemed to have never taken a shower and wore the same old drab trench coat with droopy hair and bloodshot eyes that caved into you. The moment the children went missing, Mr. Odd was put to blame. The police were called, and us children watched from the pavement as they busted down his door. Unlike the other houses, number 40 had become uncared for and ancient, crumbling and cracked. It was at the end of the street, this outcast, just like its owner. After a few hours, the police left, having found nothing. But still, the parents of the town kept a watchful eye on the house, and as Halloween finally came by, they released their children carefully into the streets. Before I left, my parents told me to stay overnight at Timmy's place. They had urgent work in the city to attend to, and thought it was safer if I stayed with their family. I was ecstatic about it, and raced outside to meet him. Timmy and I had a method to dry the town of all its sweets. We would start from number 1, and then work our way down. Then, we would come back without our costumes, and see if we could squeeze out any more from these neighbors we knew so well. The one we knew best was Ian. We bumped into him as we began making our way up to our first house. He smiled and waved at us. Timmy caught a glimpse of a purple bracelet on his wrist and asked about it. Ian's smile disappeared into a depressed look. It belonged to Sarah. We apologized to Ian and hurried along our way. Ian's daughter had been one of the missing children, and the topic darkened the mood. Regardless, we made easy pickings of the houses, until eventually, there we were, standing in front of house number 40. I don't remember which one of us came up with the idea of asking there, but determined to not chicken out in front of my friend, I knocked quietly. When there was no answer, I was prepared to spin and bolt, when the door creaked open ever so slightly. Mr. Odd, a ball in hand, held out towards us, full to the brim. Nodding without even saying the traditional line, I only took one, being careful to not look up at his face. Turning around, I began making my way down the steps, when a hand clamped down painfully on my arm. In a raspy voice,
"Be careful out there. A lot of kids going missing, you know."
And that was it. Screaming, I pulled out of his grasp and ran down the street. It was only after a while did I stop, catching my breath. Composing myself, I expected to see Timmy, but no, there was nobody. Panicking, I looked around, desperately trying to see him. Suddenly, a figure appeared from behind. It was Ian. "Hey kid, what's the matter?" I tried telling him what had happened, but it all came out in stammers and gasps. "Calm down, it's safer inside, come on." I entered his house, still looking down the street, expecting to see Timmy at any moment. Sitting me down on his couch, Ian disappeared into the kitchen for a while. He came back with a mug of hot cocoa in hand, and set it down on the table. "Drink up, kid, you look like you've seen a ghost. I'll go call the police. Sit tight." As he left, I saw a glimpse of a pistol in his other hand, but I felt safe knowing that Ian was here with me. Not a second later, there was a crash in the kitchen. Shouts of struggles, a bang, and then silence. The blood drained from my face, and I instinctively rushed to the door. Turning the knob, I began screaming as I realized it was locked. The world became drowsy around me, my vision unclear. Sprinting into another room, bumping into things along the way, I opened another door, only to stumble downwards. I was in the basement and fumbled along the wall, hoping to find a light. I eventually found a switch, flicking it on, and the sight before me curdled my stomach. Piles of corpses stacked upon one another. Some faces were familiar to me, like Patty Grangerson from school, or Danny Lewis, who played on the same football team as me. I vomited when I saw Sarah. The last body was Timmy. His throat had been opened up to a sickly red smile, his ghost costume streaked with blood. The last thing I saw was Mr. Odd, looking down at me with a puzzled look. Then, nothingness. I woke up the next morning to sirens and flashing lights. My parents were there on either side of me, as I lay in an ambulance, hoping that it was all just a dream. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Ian's house was searched, and they found all of the missing children in there. Well, most of them. A few of them were missing body parts. A psychopath had been living across my street, and I never realized it. And I never saw Timmy's parents again. Whenever I would ask my parents, they would just sigh and shake their heads. Mr. Odd still lives down the road. He doesn't bother nobody, and nobody bothers him. But every time I remember Sarah's bracelet, or the last moments I saw Timmy, I can't help but cry in delight. Yeah, you heard me right? I mean, who else could have helped Ian? The three boys gathered on the sidewalk. It was almost midnight. They went to the Halloween parade and continued having fun while plotting to scare others. On the sidewalk, there was the front of a hospital. The three of them stood under the morgue window. However, the window was at a considerable height, but there was a tree which they planned to climb up to look inside. Gerardo saw a lady turn a corner and walk towards them. "People are coming," he warned the others, and immediately looked away. "We have to wait for it to happen," said another of the boys. The lady was crossing slowly. Then she seemed to remember. She looked at the window and quickened her pace. In the city, almost everyone had heard some frightening story about that window. Mainly, it was said that some apparitions were observed from there by people passing by on the sidewalk. It was also said that a scary voice called people by their name and laughed. The lady entered the other block. Seeing that the street was deserted, they made up their minds. "Who goes up first?" asked one of them. "Me," said Gerardo. He looked at the tree, lifted a foot to a low branch, and began to climb. The others watched him, turned to the end of the street and looked at each other, trying to guess the degree of fear each felt. Gerardo reached window level. He then gripped the window with both of his arms. With his feet, he braced on a branch that trembled under his weight. Then, he looked towards the morgue. The first thing he saw was the autopsy table, which was empty. Next to it were 4 gurney tables, and on one of them, covered with a sheet, was a body. Gerardo was looking at it, when suddenly, the body straightened up to sit. He then pulled the sheet off with his hands, and Gerardo saw that the dead man looked just like him, and the dead man looked at him and pointed. Gerardo shuddered so much that his feet slipped, and when he let go of the trunk, he fell to the ground and hit his head, dying on the spot. An hour and a half later, Gerardo was inside the morgue, and they put him on that very table.